All right, so buckle up, because what just happened at this World Cup is the kind of thing that a week ago would have sounded like a fever dream cooked up by a conspiracy account, not something that actually took place inside the most powerful sports organization on the planet. For 50 plus years, there was exactly one rule in this tournament that nobody could touch. One rule that didn't care who you were, how many goals you'd scored, or whose flag you were playing under. Straight red card. One game gone. Automatic. No hearing. No lawyer. No phone call could save you. And then in the span of about 4 days, that rule simply stopped existing for one man. Not a random man, the best player on the team hosting the tournament, and it stopped existing right around the time the President of the United States picked up the phone and dialed the head of FIFA directly. So let's actually walk through this piece by piece, because the details here are wilder than the headline. Start with the moment that kicked all of this off, because on its own, it really did look like nothing more than one of those unlucky refereeing moments that happens in basically every knockout match ever played. The United States were cruising past Bosnia and Herzegovina, up 2-0, comfortable, the kind of game where you're already thinking about the next round. Folarin Balogun, the guy who'd been the sharpest attacking weapon on this entire roster, went into a challenge for the ball and his boot ended up raking down the back of an opponent's ankle. In real time, barely anyone noticed. Then the video review got involved. The referee jogged over to the monitor, watched the replay a few times, and made the call. Straight red, serious foul play. Was it harsh? Genuinely. A lot of neutral observers thought so. We'll get back to that, because it's actually the one part of this story where the American complaint has real merit. But here's what should have happened next. What has happened to literally every other player sent off at this tournament? He sits out the next game. That's not a guideline. That's the rule written into the competition regulations in black and white, and it had already been applied without exception a dozen separate times before this exact Sunday rolled around. So Balogun should have been done for the Belgium match. That's not opinion. That's just how the rulebook reads. And every single federation at this tournament had already accepted that exact outcome when it happened to their own players. And then quietly over the following 72 hours, something started moving behind the scenes that had nothing to do with football at all. According to multiple major outlets, CBS, ESPN, NPR, the New York Times, the machinery of the U.S. government itself got pulled into what should have been a routine disciplinary matter. Andrew Giuliani, who runs the White House's own task force built specifically around this World Cup, flagged the situation upward. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick was reportedly looped in on conversations with FIFA. And then the president himself made contact, not once, but reportedly across multiple calls, eventually reaching FIFA President Gianni Infantino directly to raise the subject of Balogun's suspension. Infantino, according to the reporting, didn't make any promises on the spot, but told the president his disciplinary committee would take a look. Sit with that for a second, because it's worth sitting with. A sitting head of state personally lobbying the leader of world football's governing body about a single player's one-game ban. Not a policy dispute, not a diplomatic crisis. A yellow card adjacent suspension for a soccer tackle, and then days later, it worked. FIFA's disciplinary committee announced that Balogun's ban wasn't being removed exactly. It was being suspended, put on ice, for a full year of probation, meaning the red card stays on paper, but the punishment attached to it just doesn't apply. Not this time. He was cleared, official statement in hand, to start for the United States against Belgium. And within minutes, the president was online celebrating the reversal as a wrong finally being righted. Now, here's where you need to actually understand the mechanism, because this wasn't some obvious loophole sitting in plain sight that everyone had simply chosen not to use before. FIFA reached for a provision buried inside its disciplinary code, Article 27, language that, in theory, allows the organization's judicial arm to fully or partially suspend a punishment under certain circumstances. It's broad, it's vague, and crucially, it had never once been invoked at a men's World Cup in the entire history of using red and yellow cards at this tournament. Stretching back to 1970, not once. 56 years of red cards, 56 years of automatic bans, and precisely 0 instances of a country's government successfully lobbying that ban away, right up until this particular Sunday in July. There's actually only one case in the entire historical record that even rhymes with this, and it's from 1962, involving Brazil's Garrincha back in an era before automatic suspensions even existed as a concept, back when everything ran through committee discretion rather than a fixed rulebook. Even that older, murkier precedent came wrapped in its own whispers of political maneuvering, which tells you something about how long this particular shadow has followed FIFA around. And when journalists pushed the organization to actually explain its reasoning this time, why this player, why this tackle, why now, the answer they got back was close to nothing. No published rationale, no detailed breakdown of what evidence supposedly changed the outcome. Just a vague pointer toward an earlier, unrelated case involving Cristiano Ronaldo, a comparison that collapses the second you check the facts because Ronaldo's red card happened during qualifying, an entirely different stage of competition governed by different circumstances. For Balogun, instead of an explanation, there was just silence. And silence in a situation already this loaded doesn't read as neutral, it reads as something being hidden. Let's pause on why this particular player mattered enough to trigger presidential phone calls in the first place. Because this part of the story deserves real credit, not cynicism. Folarin Balogun isn't a bench piece who happened to catch a bad break. He is, by a wide margin, the single most important attacking threat the United States has going into this tournament. 25 years old, sharp, technical, a forward who came up through Arsenal's academy before finding his rhythm at Monaco, and heading into that Bosnia match, he'd already produced a goal contribution in every single appearance he'd made at this World Cup. 3 goals, 3 starts, 0 blanks. That is not hype. That's output game after game, the exact profile of a player who single-handedly stretches a defense and creates room for everyone playing around him. This American team under Pochettino is playing the best football this program has produced in a generation, chasing a first World Cup quarterfinal appearance since 2002, and a huge chunk of the credit for that surge belongs to the man who plants himself on the last defender's shoulder and finishes the chances that come his way. Remember, this exact Belgium side put 5 goals past the Americans in a friendly back in March. The gap between that humiliation and the confident team on the pitch now is in large part one player's fingerprints. So when the White House says it understood exactly what was at stake by keeping Balogun on the field, that part isn't an exaggeration. He is the difference maker and everyone involved knew it. And there's a sympathetic layer buried in here too, worth acknowledging honestly. American fans felt like Balogun had effectively been punished twice over. First, by playing more than half an hour down a man against Bosnia after the sending off, and then again by being told he'd missed the biggest match of the tournament so far entirely. Balogun himself, by every account, handled the whole situation with remarkable composure, refusing to lash out publicly, talking instead about staying calm for the young fans watching, calling the entire ordeal surreal rather than unjust. That's the player at the center of this. Someone who, by all appearances, took the original decision on the chin, which makes what happened next even stranger, because the fight to overturn his ban wasn't fought by him. It was fought over his head, by people with considerably more leverage than a 25-year-old striker holds on his own. Which brings us to the moment this whole thing stopped being a feel-good underdog story and turned into something considerably uglier, the reaction from the other side of the pitch. Belgium understandably did not take this well. Their federation's public statement used the word astonished, and then went further, laying out in precise, almost forensic detail exactly which regulations FIFA had just bulldozed through, pointing specifically to the automatic suspension clause that every single participating nation had been formally reminded of, in writing, back in May, well before the tournament even began. Their argument essentially was that FIFA had taken a broad disciplinary tool meant for entirely different circumstances and used it to override the tournament's own explicit competition rules. Rules FIFA itself had distributed to every team as a settled matter. Belgium's head coach didn't hold back either, dryly noting that this particular date on the calendar had apparently turned into an April Fool's joke a few months late, and insisting the issue at stake wasn't really about protecting his own team's chances. It was about protecting the integrity of the sport itself. And it wasn't just Belgium. The response from the broader football world was close to unanimous and unusually blunt for an industry that tends to hedge everything in diplomatic language. Former England international Wayne Rooney, someone who's never exactly been squeamish about physical, aggressive football, called the whole situation a disgrace and said Infantino personally should feel embarrassed by it. Fellow pundit Micah Richards said the probationary ruling made a mockery of the entire competition. Over on a rival broadcast, Gary Neville needed exactly 2 words to sum up his reaction, and both of them were unflattering, and maybe the sharpest voice of all belonged to England's own manager, who just watched one of his own defenders get sent off in a completely different match, meaning that player would miss England's own quarterfinal with 0 chance of appeal, 0 phone calls, 0 probationary loophole. His question cut right to the heart of the entire controversy: where exactly does this stop, and who gets to decide whose ban is negotiable? Because that's the actual scandal buried underneath all of this. More than any single overturned red card. Look at who else has been in Balogun's exact position this tournament and got nothing. A Qatari defender was hit with a 5-match ban for a challenge that broke an opponent's leg, even though there's a legitimate case that the injury resulted from an unfortunate accident rather than genuine malice. 5 matches, full stop, no reconsideration, no phone call on his behalf. Meanwhile, observers pointed out that Lionel Messi appeared to escape a strikingly similar challenge during Argentina's opening match without so much as a caution. So the pattern that emerges isn't really about the severity of the offense at all. It's about whether someone with enough institutional weight is willing to personally intervene on your behalf. That's not a technicality. That's the entire foundation of competitive fairness quietly cracking in real time. Now, to be fair to the American side of this argument, because the strongest version of their case deserves to be heard honestly, rather than dismissed outright, the red card itself probably was excessive. Pochettino argued that the overwhelming consensus among football people was that the tackle looked far worse in isolated slow motion than it actually was in the run of play, and plenty of neutral commentators agreed with that red. Playing more than half a match down a man in a World Cup knockout tie is already a brutal cost. And there's a genuinely reasonable conversation to be had about whether football needs some kind of formal appeals mechanism for exactly these borderline, unintentional dismissals, a transparent published process, available equally to every federation, rather than a closed-door committee that answers to no one. If that process had existed and Balogun's ban had been lifted through it, this would be a completely different story, maybe even a positive one for the sport's credibility. But that is not what happened here. What happened here was a vague, previously unused clause applied for the very first time in tournament history, days after presidential phone calls, with zero public explanation of the reasoning behind it. And that distinction matters enormously, because FIFA's own governing statutes explicitly claim to prohibit political interference in the sport. This is also happening against the backdrop of an already uncomfortably close relationship between Infantino and the American president, one that includes Infantino being a regular presence around the administration, an unusual Peace Prize ceremony connecting the two men, and a scheduled joint appearance where they'll hand over the World Cup trophy together in a matter of days. You don't need to reach for some elaborate conspiracy theory to see the problem here. You just need to notice the timeline. And here's the part that should worry anyone who actually cares about this sport beyond just this single tournament. The damage doesn't undo itself, even if it turns out the underlying decision was, in some technical sense, defensible. Because from this point forward, every single contested red card for the remainder of this competition now carries an invisible asterisk. Would this ban have held up if the right person had made the right call? If the United States advances past Belgium, a genuine chunk of the watching world will view that result through the lens of a favor rather than a fair outcome, regardless of how the players themselves actually performed on the pitch. And the precedent doesn't stay contained to this one tournament either. If a foundational, decades-old rule can bend once for one government under enough pressure, what exactly stops the next head of state in the next major tournament from trying the identical playbook? FIFA had spent this entire World Cup accumulating some of the most positive global attention it's had in years. And in the span of a single weekend, over a single disciplinary decision, it traded a meaningful chunk of that credibility away. The rule itself technically is still sitting there in the regulations, unchanged on paper, but the confidence that it actually applies evenly to everyone, regardless of stature or connections, that's the part that just took the hit. That's not a footnote to a suspension. That's a genuine fracture running straight through the one thing that makes any of this worth watching in the first place. The belief that the outcome on the pitch is determined by what actually happens on the pitch, not by who's willing to pick up a phone on your behalf. So here's the honest question hanging over the rest of this tournament. If your team gets a man sent off in the next knockout round, how much do you actually trust that suspension to hold? And if you were building your own list of who to call when the rules suddenly become negotiable, who exactly would be on it? Drop your answer down in the comments, because this fight between Belgium, UEFA, and FIFA is nowhere close to finished, and subscribe because you do not want to miss where it goes next.